Looks like everyone is very punctual this morning. Good. So this morning we're going to dive into the substance of our weekend workshop. And the first question that we have scheduled to address, I did make note, by the way, of the various questions that you all raised last night, and we will try to weave those into our conversation during the weekend. But for the moment, we'll just plunge ahead with the agenda that had been planned, which was to begin this morning with the question, what is meant by freedom from conditioning? And this is, I think, a very interesting and potentially fertile question. I'll just make a couple of introductory comments about it and then ask Dr. Krishna for some further clarification. Conditioning is one of those things that on the surface seems to be one of the relatively straightforward elements of the teachings of Krishnamurti, something that we can pretty well understand what he means, what he has in mind. He often refers to conditioning in terms of the religious tradition in which one may have been raised, or one's nationality, and whether or not one can put aside that kind of sort of structure imposed on one's consciousness. But as you get into the study of the teachings a little bit further, it's not quite so clear what exactly is meant by that term, or freedom from conditioning. When I came to the Oak Grove School, the year that it opened, in 1975, Krishnamurti had written out a statement of the intent of the Oak Grove School. And among other things, he said in that statement, he said that in this school, it is the responsibility of the teacher to explore with the student his own conditioning and the student's conditioning, and therefore end it. And at that time, I was the only teacher at the school. We just had a handful of students, and I felt very keenly this responsibility which had been imposed upon us, and it was quite a mystery to me how I would ever be able to even just uncondition myself, much less uncondition these 4 or 5 students who were 9 and 10 years old, and I was having trouble teaching them how to add and subtract fractions, and now it was my deep responsibility to uncondition them as well as myself. And so when you look into it a little bit more deeply, you find that what Krishnamurti means by conditioning goes well beyond just the religious ideology or the nationality you might have been born into. And in some places he says things like, knowledge is conditioning. All of knowledge is conditioning. So then that's rather vast, and it seems to imply that freedom from conditioning means freedom from all knowledge. Is that really possible? Is that really what he means to say? And sometimes he seems to refer to something called the unconditioned mind. And it seems to imply that conditioning is like, it's sort of like a garment, like an overcoat that you're kind of born wearing. And if you can figure out how to approach it properly, you can kind of take that coat off, and now you're done with it. You used to be a person who was conditioned, and now you're a person who is unconditioned. So these are some of the questions that arise in trying to reflect on the meaning of conditioning, the meaning of what would be meant by freedom from conditioning. And I'll just add one more little point. If we say that knowledge per se is conditioned, is conditioning, Krishnamurti often makes a distinction between merely practical knowledge, what he calls technological knowledge, versus psychological knowledge of relationships and people in your life and your memories about yourself. And he indicates that, what he calls technological knowledge, there's nothing wrong with it. We need that kind of knowledge in order to navigate the world or drive a car or do any of the work things that we do. And if all of knowledge is conditioning, then it seems to suggest that maybe there's a similar distinction to be made with respect to conditioning. Maybe there's some conditioning which is good conditioning, like technological knowledge, and other conditioning which is the bad kind. And how can we learn to be sensitive to that distinction if it exists? So is the unconditioned mind sort of an all or nothing thing that we either have it or don't? These are some of the questions that occur to me in connection with this question, what is meant by freedom from conditioning?
I think it becomes clearer when you connect this with other parts of his teaching where he talks about putting everything in its right place.
Yes.
Thought and imagination and knowledge and money and sex, and that if you put everything in its right place, then you're free. Mm-hmm. It does not occupy your consciousness or doesn't become obsessive, and so doesn't create any disorder in consciousness. So freedom from conditioning does not mean absence of conditioning. Freedom from anything is not absence of that thing. It is absence of attachment or obsession with that thing. It's when you are attached or obsessed with something, it fills your consciousness, and that creates disorder in consciousness because it relegates everything else in life to a very secondary position, and your consciousness is constantly occupied with your religion or your son or your science or whatever, to the exclusion of everything else. So it ceases to be holistic living, and that creates its own divisions, both within and without. So I think one has to understand this statement of Krishnaji that without freedom from conditioning, you don't have a basis for your thinking, and therefore all thought gets colored, and so thought ceases to be an instrument for the quest of truth, because it will always distort the truth that it perceives. That is true only when there is attachment. For example, I am born in India. That's a fact, that I was born in that country, that part of the world which is called India. But when I give tremendous importance to that, call it my country, and I want to defend that country and protect that country, and to the exclusion of other countries and so on, it occupies my consciousness, it creates patriotism and so on. So I have put that fact in, have given more importance to that fact than is normal. But as a fact, it is true that I was born there, that I was brought up in a certain family which had Hindu ideals and so on. But if that the importance that I give, the feeling of possession or ownership, that it is my religion, it is my country, it is my family, my opinion, and therefore it starts acquiring an importance much greater than other people's opinions or things like that. Then your mind is colored and you are always looking from that particular point of view. And you are not able to be objective or impartial. And in that sense, then the quest, instead of being a quest for truth, becomes a quest for benefiting me and the mind, victory for me and the mind, security for the me and the mind. So the whole of the mind gets hijacked into thinking in terms of what is beneficial for me and the mind. And that's what constitutes the ego. Yeah. But of course I am responsible for my child, I am responsible for my school, I am responsible for teaching physics, which is my knowledge. So it has a certain place, but when I put it out of place, and it creates the ego, which in turn creates disorder in consciousness. So I think that freedom from conditioning is not absence of conditioning, but of putting everything in its right place. At other places he also called it the art of living. It's an art to put everything in its right place. When everything is put in its right place, there is beauty. In nature, everything is in its right place, so nature is, you see beauty there. In a painting, when everything is put in the right place, it creates beauty. And he's talking about a certain beauty in our life, that when you put everything in its right place, there is a sense of beauty in putting that, which is destroyed when you give too much importance to something or ignore it also, too little to something. And that is what creates the disorder, and the disorder is things like anger and jealousy and fear and sorrow and all the negative emotions, and that occupies the consciousness and prevents it from seeing things as they are. So that's how I understand freedom from conditioning, as not absence of conditioning, but of putting everything in its right place. Which well, you can't define what the right place is, so you have to find out, discover that for yourself through playing with it in your life. That's why it is part of self-knowledge.
So wouldn't you say that there may be at least some forms of conditioning that are, say, pernicious or potentially pernicious in and of themselves, and that isn't there a place with respect to some kinds of conditioning to go a little bit further than what you said, not merely end my attachment to it, but end it, which is what Krishnamurti seems to say or imply in the intent of the Oak Grove School. I'll understand my conditioning and therefore end it. Like, suppose that I'm born into a certain religious or, let's say, cultural ideology which in and of itself glorifies a certain group and actively advocates violence, armed violence against people who are not members of my group. I don't think we would want to say, would we, that it's okay to have that ideology as long as I'm not attached to it. Isn't there a place really to end conditioning?
It's not that it is okay to have that ideology, but the fact is that you have grown up with that ideology, and therefore it is recorded in your brain. There is no way you can erase what is recorded in your brain. It is held in It's a fact that I was brought up in a Brahmin Hindu family, and so there was vegetarianism and certain morals and so on. I grew up with that. It's all there, sitting there in my brain. How do you wipe that out without wiping out any factual part and so on? Because there is a factual part to it. But when you give tremendous importance to that and you look down on others who don't have that as inferior, and you feel pride and vanity in it, or you are investing psychologically and deriving a reputation out of it and so on, even if that be your professional knowledge, all that constitutes the ego, and that creates feeling of superiority, inferiority, judgment, division. You can see that. But there are other aspects, innocent aspects of conditioning which are healthy and which you don't need to give up or fight with or erase. For instance, you grow up with a certain type of music and your brain becomes sensitive to that music and it evokes a certain emotion in you and so on. Now, that doesn't create any disorder in consciousness, unless of course you start identifying with it and calling it mine and saying this is the best music in the world and that kind of thing. You can always do that with that kind of thinking. But by itself, it's an innocent conditioning. You have a certain, it even leads to a certain sensitivity to that type of music, but you may not have that to Chinese music or Japanese music. You have that to Indian music or Western music. There is no reason it doesn't create any problem. So I think when we talk about self-knowledge, it is not a set of ideas that I should not have conditioning, that all conditioning is bad. You have to discern what creates disorder in consciousness and that which does not create disorder in consciousness. Why bother? It's there. It's like your body is there. The skin color is there. It's only when you become proud of it that you might become racist or something. But the object in itself, the fact in itself, the knowledge in itself does not create any problems. It is the attachment to that, the importance you give to that, the psychological investment in that, deriving an identity and using that to overcome your feeling of loneliness or isolation by belonging to a group, and therefore it becomes my group. All that psychological thing is what creates the problem, and one needs to observe that and intelligently understand that. Otherwise you'll throw the baby with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. You know, you have the language, you have all your knowledge, how to run a car. I mean, all right, that's also a conditioning. You acquired it gradually, or to type and so on. But those are they are conditioning in the sense that the brain does it mechanically, but they don't create any disorder in consciousness. Yeah. So I think it needs a certain amount of investigation, which is you play with it and not just form an idea that this is bad, this is good. That kind of thing, he has denied that. He has said that virtue is not something you can practice. You cannot first lay down this is virtue, this is vice, and then use your will to practice virtue and avoid vice. Virtue is a state of being or consciousness where there is freedom, where there is balance. And that balance is destroyed when you give too much importance to one thing and too little to another. And that is the learning which is part of self-knowledge. The balance between reason and love, between emotion and thought, thinking, All that is part of life and something to be learned. And this question is not normally put to us in our education. So we just grow up imitating whatever is around us. And he's saying that you need to learn this. And that learning will bring you to freedom from conditioning.
So in one of our earlier conversations, we were discussing a different subject, a different topic, but you raised an example, a kind of metaphor that I'd like to transplant into this conversation and see how it works out. We were talking about, you mentioned a situation where there's a tennis match and there's various different people watching the tennis match. One of the people watching is the coach of one of the players, and because he's the coach, he's very concerned with exactly how his player is playing and whether or not his player is obeying the instructions that the coach has given and how that's influencing the game. And another person who's watching is the referee of the match, and he's very concerned with rule violations and whether the ball is landing inside the line or outside the line. And another person watching is the photographer, and he wants to get a very colorful, exciting shot, and maybe one of the women, he can get a sexy photo of one of the women playing. So they each come to it with their own, let's say, conditioning. And so that would raise the question, what would it be like for a member of the audience or an observer to watch the tennis match in a manner in which they are unconditioned or free from their conditioning or without attachment to conditioning? What would they observe? How would they be relating to it? Because at the very least, in order to even understand what the tennis match is all about, you have to understand the scoring system and what the rules are, and that in and of itself is a kind of knowledge, which is a form of conditioning. You can't put that aside in order to even understand what's going on. So what is the state of mind of an observer of the tennis match who is either unconditioned or free from their conditioning, or however you like to put it?
I don't think one should make that into a goal to be achieved. Otherwise it becomes like an ideal and wanting to struggle to achieve that ideal. But just to observe the fact that our motive or desire with which we watch something colors your perception. It selects only certain aspects you want to concentrate on, and you ignore other aspects. That's a fact. One is not saying it's a bad fact or a good fact. To be aware of this fact, where it is necessary, you might use it. Where you want to concentrate on your physics book or something, you are using concentration, but you are aware that you are concentrating and what are the consequences of concentrating. And that is not the same thing as giving attention and being aware of the whole, that it prevents the awareness of the whole. So in the context of the tennis match, I was saying that one of the very good players, a lady from India called Sania Mirza, who has come among the first 100 in the world and so on, happens to be a Muslim. Now the Muslim cleric looking at her playing is appalled that she is exposing her legs and in wearing that kind of dress. And so he reacts with that, and he issues a fatwa that this is a Muslim girl and she should not play tennis and so on. This actually happened.
A fatwa?
Yeah. So he cannot watch the game, no? He's looking at her legs and he's reacting to that. And similarly, the press photographer who is coming with the intention of taking a sexy picture for his magazine is not able to watch the tennis, but he's watching with a particular motive, and that motive dictates what he will see. Now this is a fact. It's not saying that you should never do this or so on. But to be aware of the fact that your motive colors your perception. That's the truth. And therefore, when you want to perceive holistically, when you are seeking the truth, or when you are wanting to see the beauty of a tennis game being played, you mustn't bring in your desires into it. You must watch like a true witness, with a witness consciousness, or what Krishnamurti called passive awareness, where you are not bringing in anything of your judgment or your views into your watching. You are just simply watching what is taking place and noticing the delight in that. That would be an observer who has not taken sides, who is aware of the excellence of the players and who has no motive in either side, either winning or losing. Now if you see that, you will notice your own conditioning when you see a game being played like that on television. You will see that your mind somehow gives great importance to the players of your country. Mm-hmm. And when they excel, you want to clap, and when the other fellow excels, then you don't notice the excellence, you are downcast that he played well and so on. So you can see that it colors your perception. That's all that is being said, that when you have that kind of conditioning, which is an identification with a country or with a player or with a motive, it will color your perception and you will not see the truth in a holistic way. So in the religious quest, where one is in quest of truth, it is important to be free from motive, to be free from that kind of identification, which is what Krishnamurti calls freedom from conditioning. Without that, your judgment, your opinion has no meaning. It's a very subjective opinion, it's no longer the truth. Just as the fatwa issued by the Muslim cleric is not the truth about that girl's playing. It is just his point of view, his opinion about whether somebody should play like that or not. And he has given tremendous importance to it because he has religious notions and so on behind it. So it's just a gross example, but the same kind of thing happens in our mind also, not in such a gross form. But if you have judgments, prejudgments, prejudices, they operate in your perceptions. And you often end up seeing what you want to see, and not what the truth is. You don't see the truth. So it becomes a barrier to the perception of truth. It's from that point of view, it's a barrier in the religious quest. If you are interested in the religious quest, but people who are interested in victory, they are not interested in the religious quest, then they won't bother about it. They'll say, what are you talking about? If I compete, if I am egoistic, I win. So his aim determines what he wants. If you want the religious quest, if you want to understand what creates disorder in consciousness and so on, then you have to watch with passive awareness, without bringing in your motives and so on. In science, we would say that's objective, no? Objective watching. Don't bring in your desires, don't take sides with your own theory and so on. Then only you are in quest of truth. It's much more difficult here because the subjectivity here is so strong. You're watching your own emotions and so on. Yeah.
That can be done like you're watching a match. Then you say you don't want to be watching with your conditioned mind. So you're clear about that thing. But then all of a sudden you see your country losing. You feel something. But then so it's a fight going within. That on one hand you say, you want to favor your country, but on the other hand, you want to get rid of your conditioning, Yeah,
I think don't moralize about it. What I am saying is, I mean, this is my opinion. Krishnamurti has not said this. A certain amount of it doesn't produce any disorder or any serious division. You're not hating the other people and so on. So it's a kind of mild preference. It's like somebody offers you 2 sweets or 3 sweets on a plate. Now, you take the one which you like better, right? What will you do otherwise? Choicelessly, how do you take 3 sweets? You have to take all 3. So it would become ridiculous if you try to make an ideal out of it. So then it's all right to take one and so on. But elsewhere, you'll find that if you are not aware of this, you come to judgments and conclusions which are erroneous or which produce hatred or division and so on. So that's why I think in his teaching, he has said that every time you experience a negative emotion in you, either a conflict or a frustration or a hatred or anger, which is very palpable because it's painful, psychologically painful. So you can notice it. It's an opportunity to learn about yourself, that from where did this arise in me? So that's the question, right? And now you need to watch that in your daily life in order to find the causation which brings it about. And you will see that the causation lies in some identification or some something where you have given tremendous importance to something, and if you see the illusion of it, illusion meaning it's not their part of nature, but it's just your construct, like the cleric, Muslim cleric, it is his construct that a woman should not show her leg, right? It's his conditioning. So when you notice that, the falseness of it, then it drops away. And it drops away because you know that it's connected with the sorrow that you are experiencing, the suffering that you are experiencing.
So basically you cannot drop it, but if you realize, if you understand completely, that it will drop by itself.
That's right, that's right. That is the teaching.
So by dropping, you say, okay, I will drop it as a willpower, but you cannot do that. Or same thing, you can't love anybody, say, I will love this person. I mean, it's a willpower, but automatically if your mindset is like that, it will come automatically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another part of his teaching which needs to be deeply examined. He said, perception is action. We think will is action. I use my will to suppress that, or I'm taking action on my anger, like that. And he's saying, no, this suppression will only prevent its manifestation, but the cause of it has not been eliminated. Therefore, it will come up again in your life. And again, you will have to fight with it, so that life becomes a battle between what you are and what you think you should be. And that's not a religious life. So he's saying more important is to watch the causation, and when the causation is not organic, then it can be ended because it's starting from some notion, some illusion which you are holding on to, which is not true, right? And therefore, once you see the falseness of it, and you see the connection between that suffering and this holding on to this illusion, then it will drop away by the very perception, because it's like when there is real danger and you perceive danger, it doesn't require any willpower to not embrace danger. Nature has put an intelligence in us which does not let us embrace danger. But we embrace the ego because it's not clear to us the danger of the ego. So he's saying, don't discard the ego, don't say ego should not be there. Watch it and see the consequences of it, and you will discover for yourself the danger of approaching egoistically. You will also see that the ego is not part of nature, it is something that comes out of your approach to life or to that activity, and therefore if you change that approach, it will go. It's not there, it's just an illusion, right? So then perception is action, because that will actually bring about a change. So real change, not an affectation, not willpower, not suppression. Real change is a byproduct of self-knowledge, of understanding for yourself the danger of that.
So I just wanted to put in one more point to follow up on what we were saying, and then we'll open it up for comments from everyone. But I just wanted to say that if you say that freedom from conditioning, it does not mean there is no conditioning. It means that it means something rather different. That one is merely, it's freedom from attachment to the conditioning. It means that the conditioning doesn't go away. The attachment to the conditioning, one sees the falseness or illusion of that, and it drops away of its own accord. But this makes me want to ask you, doesn't this seem to suggest that, isn't this manner of putting it, doesn't this represent a slight shift vis-a-vis the way this issue has been expressed by Krishnamurti? Perhaps I'm mistaken, but it is my impression that in his exposition of this matter, he does refer to seeing one's conditioning and therefore ending it. And he does refer to something that he refers to as, the unconditioned mind. And perhaps I've misread what he said, but it seems to me there's an implication, if not an outright statement, in the teachings as he's expressed it, that it's something a little bit more categorical than merely being free of one's attachment to the conditioning. He seems to imply that the conditioning per se is something that you let go of and then it's gone. And once you really see the falseness of it, it's gone. It doesn't come back. So your exposition, if I may say so, sounds to me a little bit more subtle, perhaps, and a slight modification. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but I would like to know if you would acknowledge that the way that you're expressing it has a certain shift from the way it happens to come out when Krishnamurti is discussing it on the public platform and so on.
Yeah, what I have noticed is that he was not always very careful in the manner in which he was expressing making his statements. So you have to take several of his statements, you have to read his teaching, various aspects of his teaching, and put them all together, and then watch in daily life and come upon the significance for yourself. This is not something I am advocating. He himself has said that the teaching is not the truth. It points to the truth. You must investigate it, and in investigating, you will come upon the truth. So he's saying the answer to a question does not lie outside the question. It lies inside the question. You will have to investigate that question, and for that investigation, don't do it just through thinking and intellectual, but through watching in daily life and staying with that question. That kind of exploration can bring you to the truth, and you will perceive that truth, and then that truth acts on your consciousness and frees you of that corresponding disorder. So I would say, yes, he has said that you can just end the conditioning, you see the conditioning, but what is the conditioning that you see? Is it Newton's law that is creating the problem? That's not the conditioning, surely, right? Yeah, or some other factual part of knowledge. So all that is not the conditioning. I like certain types of food because I grew up with that food, and that's a certain cultivation of taste which has happened in me. It's a conditioning. But it doesn't produce any disorder in consciousness. Therefore, I would classify it as an innocent conditioning.
All right.
I like to bathe in the morning and so on. If it's too strong a habit, then I feel restless without bathing in the morning. Then I have to watch that I'm giving so much importance. It is destroying my flexibility in life. But otherwise, I like to bathe in the morning or brush my teeth in the morning. Somebody else does it in the evening. These are innocent forms of conditioning so long as they are not creating any disorder in consciousness. So you need to investigate only that conditioning which produces disorder in consciousness in the form of creating negative emotions within you or in your relationships with others or things and so on. And then you will find that it is almost always a product of the manner in which you are approaching that thing, because the fact does not create disorder. There is a factual aspect to the conditioning that doesn't create, but there is a psychological aspect to the conditioning which creates that, and that is something which relates to the attachment or the importance I give to that particular thing. Like the place we were born. It's one thing to love a river and you used to play by that river and so on. You have a certain nostalgia. It's innocent. You are not against other rivers or something,
Right,
but
right.
you just have affection for that place, that house you lived in and so on. I wouldn't say that this is conditioning, therefore destroy it and so on. No. Or for example, or that Wordsworth poem, Daffodils, where he says, for oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. Why should you get rid of that bliss? But if you are using that constantly to overcome boredom, you feel boredom, and you go on thinking about the past and bringing up this, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils, then you're misusing the memory of that. But otherwise there is an innocent memory of your childhood, your home, your parents. What's wrong with that, living there? But you have to watch, it is subtle, that if it becomes so obsessive that you are constantly using that memory, living in the past, avoiding the present because the present is boring, then you need to look at what boredom is, what makes the present boring, and not just escape from it. So that's another part of his teaching. Don't escape from what is, right? So I'm trying to say that when you take all his whole teaching, you understand things much better than when you try to analyze piecemeal one sentence which he has said and say, well, he's against all conditioning, so all conditioning is wrong. That kind of conclusion is wrong.
Okay, so that's pretty much opening the question up to the extent that I sort of had in mind, and we have almost half an hour left in this session, so there are quite a few of you who I think have questions. Yes, Laura.
I just try this. If you're saying that identification and attachment and particular conditioning is the problem, so the question is around and identification, and that seems to be universal. It happens in all minds, in all cultures and places. And Krishnamurti talked about, we have the human brain. We've inherited the human brain, and that. So, is it right to look at the real conditioning that we have to be free of? Is that self-egotistical conditioning, which would be behind, presumably, attachment and identification? Identification, I've heard him say, is the ego.
Yeah.
So that's the real conditioning somehow that we have to be free of,
Yeah.
and that's very deep and it's universal.
Yeah.
So it seems, like every child being born develops that.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, even whether it's not right to think of it, it's not organic. It could be organic. You said the brain cells themselves have to mutate.
Yeah.
So maybe we're up against something, maybe even organic and very deep-seated. I mean, as opposed to, because even children, I remember myself, I remember teaching young children, they come into contact with other children whose parents think differently than they do. And, they start to question them. I can remember one little girl saying, "Oh, I would really like to know what's true." And just the way she said it was, she was only 5 years old, right? It's interesting that that's there, but this, it seems like the real root of conditioning is
Quite right. I think it is important to investigate this in our own life, and to some extent take the question from Krishnamurti but not the answers, so that one's investigation is not colored by one's knowledge of Krishnamurti. When you do that, you will see that a human child, is very dependent, not for just 3 months or 6 months like the young one of an animal, but for something like 15 to 20 years before that child can function independently without taking help of parents. Which is why human beings have made the institution of marriage, so that the two people who produce the child take the responsibility of helping him grow or her grow through that whole dependent phase. So it is natural for that child, and perhaps even necessary, to have the attachment to its parents. It's there in animals, it is there in us also. And he feels secure in belonging to his home, in being with his parents. And it is needed, because if he didn't have that attachment, he would just veer off and he cannot manage on his own in society. He would meet with an accident or hurt himself. So I think that that kind of attachment is necessary during the growing phase. But if it continues beyond, afterwards, I think what Krishnamurti is saying is, you need to unlearn that. Because if you remain attached in that same way, it narrows you down and your mind will be all the time around it. It's like a mother has to help the child to wean away from the breast milk and be able to take milk from a glass and drink. In that way, during the developmental phase, the child needs to have this feeling of security and attachment and so on. But once he is grown up, he needs to also free himself from that kind of state of constant dependence on advice, on asking people what shall I do and so on, so that he can take his own decisions and make his way in life, become independent. So I understand him as saying that you have to introduce this question to the children right in school, that how far is dependence and advice necessary, and when should I not become too dependent on constantly seeking advice from others and so on, and take my own decisions. And of course you can make mistakes in taking those decisions, so is it very wrong to make mistakes, or are mistakes part of learning from which I grow and go beyond? So there is all this balance of how much of adventure and how much of security you need to have. And that's a balance, because if you are too much concerned with security, you cannot even walk on the road, because there is a certain amount of danger on walking on the road. Nobody will say that you should not walk on the road just because there is danger of accident. But you have to be careful and so on. So all that is also part of learning, and these questions are not raised with the children. And so we just grow up in imitation of other people and get into a certain state which produces all kinds of disorder in our consciousness. Not to the same extent in every child. Different children are attached to different extents, and different children are independent to different extents. But they all need to free themselves ultimately of that, and to be able to take responsibility for their own actions and grow up as individuals functioning in the world. And all that is part of self-knowledge. And this self-knowledge is a sort of living inquiry, existential inquiry into one's life. And it's a kind of balance where you are putting everything in its right place, including your relationship with your parents, with your home, with your religion, with everything. So that's how I understand that when you combine it, his emphasis on freedom from conditioning, when you combine it with his emphasis on putting everything in its right place, then you see that freedom does not mean the ending of all conditioning, but it means putting it all in its right place.
But Nora, if I understood your question, didn't you also bring in identification?
Yes,
And
I'm saying what is the power of that identification and attachment? I know children have to be, but it goes well beyond that. I mean, it's a very strong element of our psyche. It's a self-centered psyche, and I think that's very deep, and maybe that is the conditioning.
it's very deep, and it's not only is it not something that we put aside when we get older. On the
No.
contrary, it's something which grows and grows and grows and grows.
More, so,
Yeah.
and you know, I don't know what the perception is that would free one from attachment. Like, I mean, plenty of people may be unattached because they have no particular concern with somebody, but if you think of your relationship with your husbands or children, you know, it's the response to something that has been very beautiful and that you have loved, really. It's very hard to let... for me, it's an interesting question. What is it that would free one from attachment when it's the almost instinctive response to...
No, that's why it needs a lot of attention and a lot of watching, because if you just say attachment is evil and attachment should not be there, you will end up with indifference, which is even worse. No, so be careful. Yeah, so it is very subtle. First, to realize that these truths are very subtle, and therefore to quickly form some idea or judgment about it and act on that is another illusion. One needs to watch this very attentively. There is also responsibility. You are responsible towards your husband, towards your children, your family, your house, your own body, and so on. And there is dependence. Dependence for the fulfillment of my own needs, and so on. So, to what extent is it dependence, and to what extent is it responsibility? So, responsibility is required. Dependence creates problems, because when you are dependent, if that dependence is not fulfilled, it will produce frustration and anger and things like that. So it is subtle, and when it happens, he's saying watch it in yourself and learn about it. Learning means putting it in its right place. That's what I understand him to say. Putting in its right place is the truth about it, which is nebulous. I mean, it is not. That's why it needs a lot of attention and a lot of watching, and he says it's hard work. It's hard work not as achievement, but as coming upon that balance. Just as to have the balance of bicycling is hard work. You have to get up on the bicycle, fall a few times, and then it will come. Driving a car, it's a balance. And swimming is a balance. In the same way, inwardly, it's a balance. And if you just have formally saying this should be so, this should not be so, it is not in balance. It goes wrong. And that's why virtue cannot be practiced. You can't just decide what is right and wrong and practice with your will. He's saying you will have to study it. You have to become a learner. That learning is this. What is the right place of everything? Sexuality. What is the right place of sexuality? It's there in plants, it is there in animals, it's there in us. That's a fact. Is lust also a fact? Is pornography also a fact? Or is it a creation of my own thinking and my own attachment and the way I approach pleasure in life and so on? So you have to learn this art of living, how to relate with pleasure, and whether you can be sensitive to several pleasures and put them in their right place, or you will cultivate only one pleasure and therefore get addicted to that and then overdo it by wanting to maximize that pleasure and so on, and end up with drugs and addictions and so on. So who's going to tell you? You have got to find out what is your right relationship with pleasure. Cutting it out goes wrong. Pursuing it goes wrong. So who is going to tell you? There is no guru, no teacher who can lay down the line and say this much and not beyond. And you can't. You will not be able to obey that line, even if your own mind makes it. So he's saying you have to watch this, and it's a existential learning. You have to watch and learn like you learn driving and swimming. In that way you have to learn this also. And this learning is not been promoted in us. So we've just grown up through childhood and so on without coming upon that balance. And of course it then becomes habitual, the imbalance becomes habitual, and then we say it's very difficult, it is organic and so on. May be organic, may not be organic. There are things which are organic, there are things which are not organic. And certain amount of violence in man is there in animal also, it's organic. But no animal has become Hitler. So is that organic? Hitler was organic? No. We have made much more of violence than what animals have done. So we have not been able to put that violence in its right place. But there is violence in us. There is an organic amount of violence. And there the question is, what is my right relationship with that organic? You can't change that. The organic or the biological is there. And so thinking is there. Imagination is there and it's useful. But what is its right place? And what is its right use? And what is the wrong use? You can use imagination to create all this ego and also to create imbalance and illusion and so on. You can also use it to do surgery and planning and traveling and so on. So there is the constructive use of it and there is a destructive use of it. And unless you watch and learn, nobody is going to teach you which way to use it. So that's another way of regarding the religious quest, is the quest for discovering what is the right use of all the faculties that nature has given us in the course of evolution, including thinking, imagination, language, and physically also, all that. What is the right? And not right as some moral thing, but that which is conducive to happiness, to love, to peace, to and so on. And wrong in the sense it is conducive to unhappiness, division, violence, hatred, and so on. So we need to learn this. It is not sufficient to just grow up in imitation of everybody else. which is what is happening at present. So that aspect of learning we have all missed because our education has never cared about it. And that's what Krishnamurti is pointing out, and he wanted to change education in that direction, but we have all discovered how difficult it is to do that, because we ourselves have been educated the wrong way. And so you just have to be very creative about it and not just make the children repeat what you have gone through.
Yeah.
Which is difficult. Yeah.
Okay, are there other people? We have a few minutes left. Are there other questions from, yes, Michelle?
Sure. I mean, I guess what he said was whatever situation you confront or you come up against, whether in relationship or a problem, that everything should be seen as something fresh and new. And so, like you're saying, I mean, your education, your background, everything is sort of is a filter through which you tend to see these things. And the very awareness, I mean, you know, in the process of, you know, coming or being in a relationship, the fact that you can actually be aware of these filters you're seeing things through it is a form of progress. It's part of the process in and of itself. But if you don't even attempt to be aware of it, then you don't know that your relationship is being colored by this background. And I think even in terms of our occupations, you know, the scientific method is a good parallel. I think that that's really important. But sometimes the things that we believe to be fact, we're finding it all the time in science that the only way to make progress in terms of knowledge and finding the truth is to be able to see things clearly without the prejudice even of your own knowledge, because that knowledge may not be correct. So in terms of like higher levels of advanced knowledge, if someone can approach it with the true scientific method and say, okay, I have this hypothesis, it may or may not be correct, but whatever I discover, I'm willing to accept that. And so I think instead of having those, even, you know, your technical knowledge can be incorrect.
Can be an impediment, a form of conditioning
to
that.
really finding out the truth.
Yeah, very interesting point.
And similarly in the religious quest, to be so sure of your opinions and to regard them as truths may be a mistake. You must posit the truth as the unknown and have greater concern for the truth than for the attachment for your opinion.
Yeah,
So that opinions have to be held lightly. As in science, one would say that scientists are required to hold their theories lightly, so that if there is even one experiment which shows that it is false, you are willing to drop it and not continue with it. Yeah, unfortunately here we are just too attached to our opinions, and that's what creates division.
And more and more so.
Yeah, more and more so. Yeah.
Just one observation and one question. So first, I think, I always wondered, so this discussion to me has been very, very useful. I think the way you are putting it is very practical and very useful for day-to-day living. And one thing which I think this really clarifies is why he said truth is a pathless land, and why he said, I cannot tell you what you should do. Each of you individually should discover it yourself. Because there is nothing like, one thing. If it is there, it can be put as a Bible. And therefore, you have to look at everything fresh and then see what is probably right and what is probably, the right way of looking at it. So this is just an observation. The question is, taking her question, slightly further. So is the biggest conditioning then is the perception of an individual self? So which is that, which again, when does it drop away? When you actually see. So since childhood, someone tells me that I'm Ravi, you are important, you are intelligent, you are that, you are this, or you are stupid. And therefore I develop this image of myself, and that becomes my ego and that perception of an individual self. And if you really deeply think about it, you would realize that it is just an image. There is no difference between, me and him. We are all human beings. It's like deer 1, deer 2. They don't call themselves a superior deer and an inferior deer or anything like that. So in the same way, this is also just a perception. Now, again, it is not that it is good or bad. In some cases, there is, like you said, there is an innocent conditioning. That is, I want to give myself a name so that, people, when they want to refer to me, they can use that name. There is nothing wrong with that, so they don't get confused that who is Ravi and who is someone else. So instead of Ravi, it could be, A1 or B1 or C1. It serves the same purpose. But then if I start saying that I am better, or I am this and I need, a bigger house, and then it may be wrong. So do you see that the biggest conditioning, therefore, is this perception of an individual self?
Yes, and even that, as I pointed out, it seems to me that it is necessary in childhood that individual's feeling of self, of my family, my security, it is inevitable. It will be there. But you need to outgrow that eventually, and we are not taught to outgrow that. In fact, our entire education tries to strengthen the ego process in us, not realizing that it is the one single thing which destroys capacity for love and which creates division and creates so much danger, and that it's connected with the state of the world. It's a bit indirect because the ego seems protective. It seems my friend when you see only this far. But if you see with a long vision, which is what wisdom is, you see that it is the most destructive thing. It is causing the greatest thing. Now, therefore, it is important to have a long vision, and education should help us have a long vision. But instead, they are promoting the short vision by saying, you must stand first in the class, you must beat all your colleagues are your rival, they are competitors, they are not your brothers, not your friends. So there is a strong conditioning which promotes that me and mine has to benefit and win, and you are seeking all the time victory. It is contrary to cooperative functioning, right? So partly it is all that, partly it is instinct, right? She was right, organic side is there too. So it's not an easy thing. Even the Buddhists and the monks and so on find it difficult to do it, though they live with that thought and so on, idea. They go into other avenues, other forms of illusion and so on. So it's rather subtle. But certainly it's not easy. That's why, millions of people have probably heard Krishnamurti and studied Krishnamurti, and hardly any have been able to free themselves completely. So you can see that it is obviously very difficult, because there is inherently, I feel, that there is inherently something deeply in human consciousness that resists dropping the ego. It's a very strong attachment, the last attachment, the last illusion, I would say. It's relatively easy to see superstitions or cultural differences, and then some even psychological things which are more difficult. You have developed some complexes, psychological, because you were ill-treated in childhood and so on. Those memories come up, they are in the subconscious. That's more difficult. But still more difficult is this feeling of being a separate self. And Krishnamurti is saying, and the Buddha has said earlier, that it's just a construct. We think that there is a thinker there sitting and thinking and deciding. It's not so. It is just your conditioning that makes you feel that way. And so if you go that deep and you can free yourself of that, you perceive that it's an illusion, it will go. But you may not be able to perceive that. But so when you start inquiring, these simpler illusions will drop away first. This is not what Krishnamurti has said, this is what my investigation of his teaching has said. Maybe I am not the genius that he was, so I face this problem. So I'm not willing to say that nobody can do what Krishnamurti did, but I think it's very rare. You have someone like Jesus or Buddha, they broke away completely from the past and came upon something. You may not be able to break away completely from the past, but you can free yourself of comparison, you can free yourself of jealousy, you can free yourself of hierarchy, patriotism and so on. You will get where you get. But if you don't start inquiry at all, you don't learn about yourself at all, and you, as she said, if you are not using awareness to learn about these things, you won't get anywhere. You will just remain the way you are, and that's why the world psychologically has not changed. I mean, we have been with wars 5,000 years ago and we are still with wars. Why? I mean, do we need more experience, more wars before we know that war doesn't solve any problem? You've had enough wars, but you're not learning from wars. You're becoming more bitter, more angry, more these things going on right now. So psychologically, Krishnamurti is saying, you have not evolved psychologically. And if you don't, you're doomed. That's what he's saying, that you will annihilate yourself, kill yourself. You will have all this progress on one hand, and you will bring that wave of destruction and destroy this progress also. One nuclear bomb can do that. The next world war, even scientists are saying, will be the last war we will have. So, it is like that. These are facts. I'm not saying they are easy to solve or get rid of, no, but these are facts. Fact is fact, whether it's easy or difficult. I mean, yes, life is difficult. Nobody promised that it would be easy.
All right, thank you. This is a very good point. When we come back, I'm going to revisit the question that you raised, and then we'll introduce our second topic when we come back from our break.
About
can there be
relationship.
relationship without conflict? And maybe we can see a connection between this conversation and that one also.
Sure.
So it's not just
No, the
isolated.
ego
but
is
they
common to everything.
Common to all,
It runs
yeah.
through like a thread.
Can I just
So-
say one
Please.
observation? Because you started by, David, by raising the question, can we be free from conditioning? And the idea that you should be able to see it and just drop it. That was what you had taken from the teaching. And it seems in listening to this, we're sort of coming to this compromise place that I've been looking at for a long time, which is more the freedom within it, to accept that we're conditioned. And it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to be absolutely free from it. But I think what you're proposing is a freedom within it, a freedom to look.
Yeah.
To instead of being, it has us, we can actually open up a space within it, knowing that this is conditioning, and look at it from that space. And that in itself seems quite revolutionary to me, to be free within it. So I think there's something different between saying freedom from, which implies an endpoint, and freedom within, which implies a process of looking. So that's something I've been thinking.
Oh, okay, good. Think you so much. So,
One something as well about self.
okay.
I was thinking,
Yeah, please.
I think it seems to me that you can have a direct state of awareness without self. I think lots of people experience that. But when you need to do something functionally, you can't get rid of yourself because you need a relative position in relation to everything to make decisions. So I don't think you can ever really get rid of self because you wouldn't be able to make decisions or see directions. So I think from my point of view, it would be impossible to completely eradicate self because
Yeah.
you wouldn't be in a...
Yeah, I remember a dialogue which Krishnamurti started in Rajghat, I think 1980s, with the question, where does the self end and the other begin? So he didn't discard self as having no place, because after all you have to find food, look after this body, It's a responsibility. What is your relationship with your body? Are you owning this body, or are you a trustee looking after this body? I mean, there is, you can approach the body egoistically or non-egoistically, as you do with your child, in that way. So there are those questions also about what is the self, and how far it's responsibility, and when does it become greed and selfishness and so on. That's why this whole inquiry in self-knowledge is very subtle and very nebulous. It's a gray area in which you can't draw lines very clearly and say, now it's white, now it's black. It's not like that.
So we come back at 11:15, 11:20?
Yeah.
Ralph?
Yeah.
Ralph? Is that right?
Yeah, it is right. It's written in black and white.
I'm sorry, what did he say?